Chapter 11. Real Fairness, a mathematical tax base of all transactions.
Here's the trillion-dollar question. How many banking transactions take place within the U.S. each year? If we knew this number, then we would know the specific parameters of the largest tax base possible for the U.S. government. Interestingly, it is a challenge to determine the exact number of the total dollar volume of banking transactions, or the total in debits and credits. 30 years ago, the Federal Reserve published data on the total volume of banking transactions within the U.S. However, the data since then has been less than clear. Over the years, economists have worked to mathematically model the total volume of banking transactions to provide some parameters for the size of this potential tax base. And recently, the Federal Reserve and reports by the U.S. Treasury Department have provided some data about new banking transactions that point to a large potential tax base. We will explore the modeling and the new data. By economists' conservative estimates, today, over $850 trillion moves in banking transactions annually, including the public stock exchanges. More specifically, in 2021, the public stock exchanges amounted to an estimated $250 trillion in transactions. If the public exchanges are removed from the ABT tax base, then the total dollar volume results in a tax base of $600 trillion. Remember, that's a conservative estimate. The actual number could be significantly higher. Though some data has been reported in confusing categories and details, in the past few years, with the rise of electronic banking, central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, and developments with instant payments, such as FedNow, the federal government wants to stay ahead of this curve. So, the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Department of the Treasury have recently issued several reports which include data that indicates the possible size of the ABT tax base, including a 2022 Treasury report that details how all dollar volume transactions had risen to $1,567 trillion annually, a potentially enormous tax base. So with this conservative and less than clear data, we will use the mathematically modeled estimate of $600 trillion in banking transactions. We can safely say that a $600 trillion tax base is 50 times larger than our current primary tax base of individual salaries, which amounted to a little over $12 trillion in 2022. By broadening the tax base to banking transactions alone and limiting the tax base by eliminating all individual corporate and excise taxes, when we collect a 1% ABT tax on the estimated $600 trillion in transactions, the federal government would collect around $6 trillion, not only vastly more than existing income and corporate taxes, but an amount equal to government spending, a balanced budget. This is equitable. Again, the only way for everybody in society to contribute fairly is to have a very small tax levied or charged across every banking transaction, minimal individual impact, shared by all. It's important to remember that those who spend more money, i.e., wealthier individuals or larger corporations, will automatically be paying more money to the U.S. Treasury, while at the same, taxes remain at a very low rate for everyone. Another valuable aspect to consider is just how many people and entities outside the U.S. utilize our banking system. Right now, 20% of the world's money supply filters through the U.S. This means that a great many people and companies from around the globe use the U.S.'s marketplace infrastructure while also employing individuals who do not earn salaries within the states. In other words, these entities do not pay taxes to support the U.S. government, even though they are leveraging the U.S.'s societal infrastructure and marketplace to make money. These entities do, however, work with U.S. banks, and their banking transactions would not elude the ABT tax. Consider that J.P. Morgan Chase alone handles $8 trillion of transactions around the world on a daily basis. Even if only a minimal 10% of those transactions occur inside the U.S., then in a year's time, those transactions would provide a tax base to the tune of $150 trillion per year, and that's just one bank. Based on the estimated $600 trillion of annual banking transactions within the U.S., and again, remember this is a conservative estimate, we can safely calculate that the ABT tax would collect at least $6 trillion in tax revenue. This would cover our spending, including projected shortfalls in the Social Security Trust Fund and interest on our national debt. Take a look. Estimated tax base of dollar transactions, annually processed in the U.S., in the trillions, by the U.S. banking system. To see this graph of the estimated tax base of dollar transactions annually, go to the disruptingtaxes.org website. Of course, there will need to be a complete mathematical and computer-run analysis of the potential tax base once economic data is provided and clarified by the federal government. The calculations included in this slender volume are based on educated assessments, but they would need to be fine-tuned in a comprehensive analysis that includes actual economic data, which only the government can provide. And recognize that the ABT tax structure is inherently flexible and able to meet the country's needs. If the tax base proves to be only $500 trillion, then a very small adjustment in the rate to 1.2% per transaction raises the required revenue for the government. Alternatively, if the base is $700 trillion, then the rate would be adjusted down to 0.8% per transaction and still be able to balance the budget and pay down on debt. Moreover, Congress could pass legislation to mandate that the Treasury Department adjust, in this minor way, the percentage of the ABT tax each year and match the spending of the federal budget, make payments on the national debt, guarantee a yearly balanced federal budget, and institute a strategy that will ultimately pay off the entire national debt. A powerful framework for our economic future. Also, it is important to remember that there will be the obvious and less than obvious impacts of the ABT tax on the economy, which will need to be monitored. How will the lack of income taxes impact consumer spending? How will the 1% ABT tax, 0.5% on each side of a banking transaction, impact economic activity? What precisely will happen when corporations realize the value of removing the tax compliance burden? No more self-declaratory filings of tax returns with the ABT tax, and the long-term predictability and stability of the ABT tax? Additionally, it would be best to isolate and exempt money used in banking transactions to trade on public exchanges, which we will discuss next. Outside of transactions on the public exchanges, all banking transactions would be subject to the ABT tax. This would include the part of international transactions that pass through the U.S.-based banking systems. With the ABT tax, the politics and the influence of special interests are taken out of federal tax law. This allows the market to dictate the success of a product or service, with no favoritism due to political influence. So, neither real estate nor farming nor corporations will receive a tax break. But because the new tax rate will be so low, they will not need a tax break, as they would be operating in a truly free market for the first time. For when all tax incentives are eliminated, then you have a truly free market. Consider this for a moment. Instead of concealing loopholes and financial incentives for certain industries and individuals within the arcane volumes of the tax code, politicians will have to decide, much more publicly and transparently, which industries and institutions we want to support as a society. The wielding of political influence will be reserved only for the spending side of the equation when Congress makes its expenditure decisions. This, too, could prove invaluable to the prosperity of the nation and the longevity of U.S. institutions and democracy.